To summarize Deuteronomy into one sentence, we could say it is the principle to accompanying the Lord. It was the rules of accompanying the Lord, whereas Leviticus is the eligibility to accompany the Lord, and Numbers was the method to accompany the Lord. The Lord had given to the Israelites the instructions on how to be holy in Leviticus and how to live with the Lord in Numbers. Moses gave the Israelites the instructions on how to live in the promised land. Let's learn the method and try to put it into practice in our daily lives. Frame of the Old Testament. Follow the sequence from ages, leaders, key places, key words, national perspective, and authorities perspective to the genealogy of Jesus, the book's allocation and their representative triplets, the spiritual perspective of prophets, and lastly, BC and Adam's Chronicle. The time background of Deuteronomy was in the 40th year after they had come out of Egypt. Egypt to Mt.Sinai. There have been many different claims on the location of Mount Sinai about certain places. The major one is in the Sinai Peninsula, but it was not supported by the Bible. It was proclaimed by the Constantine Emperor's mother, Helena. She found the same mountain during her trip as she had seen Mount Sinai in her dream. And since she built a church there, it was known as Mount Sinai. Here, let's try to presume its location by considering only passages of the Bible. For this, we need to look for the location of the Red Sea first. As stated in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 26, Solomon set up a shipyard at Ezion-Geber near Elath in Edom, on the shore of the Red Sea. The location of Ezion-Geber was important in presuming where the Red Sea was located. Of course, the Red Sea was in both sides of the Sinai Peninsula, but all passages refer to the Red Sea in the Bible stated that it was only the right side of the peninsula. Another passage, Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 1, stated the route of the Red Sea on a map. The Israelites traveled to the desert in Seir for 38 years along the same route. In Judges chapter 11, verse 16, the Israelites came out of Egypt and went through the desert to the Red Sea. In other words, before arriving at the Red Sea, they came up and went through the desert. Usually, came up in the Bible was used when people went up a hill. Hence, they also went up a certain hill just after coming out of Egypt. Let's see another map for better understanding. If you look at the map in slide 14, there were no hills near the Goshen area. The northern center of the peninsula was a hill area. Here, let's take a look at the four major roads: the road to the hill of Amorite, the road to the Red Sea, or Mount Seir Road, the road to the desert of the road to Mount Seir, and the road to Philistine. They didn't take the road to Philistine, but took the road to the desert. Please notice that these are also presumptions. Let's go back to the previous slide. And through the desert meant that they almost passed through the desert and reached the Red Sea. Hence, they probably went through the northern part of the peninsula and reached the Red Sea. Exodus chapter 13, verse 18 supported this. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle. Exodus chapter 23, verse 31 defined the border of the promised land, which was from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines and from the desert to the river. The Sea of the Philistines was on the left side of the promised land. Where was the Red Sea on the map? Both the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba were the Red Sea, so the number 1 or 2 line on the map was most likely the border of the land. According to Genesis chapter 15, verse 18, the number 2 line was the border because the Egypt River was on line 2. And the desert in Exodus chapter 23 verse 31 was probably below the river of Egypt. Furthermore, the desert of Exodus chapter 13 verse 18 was also in the area. And the desert in Joshua chapter 1 verse 4 was most likely the same area. In Exodus chapter 15 verse 22, the Israelites moved into the desert of Shur from the Red Sea. The meaning of Shur in Hebrew was the flat rock. They traveled for 3 days in the desert without water. There was a big flat rock on the right side of the Gulf of Aqaba. See the rock symbol on the map. As seen in Exodus chapter 16 verse 1, they came to the desert of Sin from Elim. The Sin in Hebrew means the god of a crescent moon. There were many carvings of the bull's horn in the crescent symbol area on the map. The horns represented the crescent moon. They left Elim and camped by the Red Sea, then camped in the desert of Sin, as stated in Numbers chapter 33 verse 10 to 11. In conclusion, from the three passages above, the desert of Shur, Elim, and the desert of Sin were located along the Red Sea. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came to Moses in the desert as stated in Exodus chapter 18 verse 5. He brought Moses' sons and wife. And as seen in Numbers chapter 10 verse 31, Moses told him when he planned to go back to his home, and that he could be their eyes because he knew the desert very well. As stated in Exodus chapter 3 verse 1, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The far side of the desert was most likely in the west end of the desert of Midian, because Moses was in Midian for 40 years, as stated in Acts chapter 7 verse 13. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mt.Sinai. Considering these four passages and Jethro's hometown, Midian, the desert was most probably in Midian, not in the Sinai Peninsula. There is an interesting scientific research that supported this. The depth of the Gulf of Aqaba is 1 to 1.5 kilometers, but the area is just 15 meters, and it is a slow slope at 6 degrees. It looks like an underwater bridge connecting both sides. It was most likely formed by the erosion from the mountains of both sides. Mt.Sinai to Kadesh. Let's see the itinerary from Mt.Sinai to Kadesh Barnea in order to verify the location of Mt.Sinai. As written in Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 2, it took 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the Mount Seir road. Where was the Mount Seir road? It was probably the road toward Mount Seir or along the Seir mountains in a circle on the map. They passed the road from Mt.Sinai wherever it was. As stated in Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 7, they advanced into the Ammon and Arabah and Negev. If you follow these places on the map, you will realize which place was more suitable to go through with this passage. One of the most important passages was Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 19. We set out from Horeb and went toward the hill country of the Amorites through all that vast and dreadful desert that you have seen. And so we reached Kadesh Barnea. What were all those vast and dreadful deserts? Do you remember the name of the desert we referred to after the Red Sea? They were the desert of Shur and Sin. Why were they? Because they had seen them as written in Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 19. As I was saying, Exodus chapter 3 verse 1 stated the far side of the desert, which would be in the land of Midian. As written Exodus chapter 3 verse 12, when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. As stated in Exodus chapter 18 verse 5, Jethro visited him near the mountain of God. There is an important evidence in the New Testament, Galatians chapter 4 verse 25. Now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem. Arabia was presumed as a Median, where Paul stayed for some time after the regeneration, as written in Galatians chapter 1 verse 17. I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. As stated in Exodus chapter 19 verse 18, Mount Sinai was burned by a very high temperature fire, and there must have been a trace on the top of the mountain. The mountain of Laos in Saudi Arabia has a few marks that show that the top of it had been burned. As seen in Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 5 and chapter 5 verse 24, the top of the mountain could be seen from the ground where the people stayed. For 2 million people, a place this big was required just next to the mountain. There is such a space by Mountain Laos, but it isn't by the mountain in the Sinai Peninsula. In conclusion, no one knows the location of Mount Sinai because the Lord does not show it to us. But we can just say that the current mountain in the Sinai Peninsula is not real according to the biblical evidence. The location of it is not important. The fact that the Lord descended to the people to convince and discipline them is important, because the Holy Spirit descended for us today, like the Lord did for the Israelites. Thank you for watching.